Hello, namaste, and vanakkam. Welcome to the Hindu. I am G. Sampath. Now, conflict prevention and conflict resolution have always been key objectives of international diplomacy. But in recent years, it would seem that diplomacy is giving way to brute force as a means of conflict resolution. And right now, there are two conflicts that is on everyone's mind. The Russia-Ukraine war, which has been going on since February 2022, and the slaughter of civilians and children in Gaza, which has been on since October 2023. And both these major conflicts haven't really been helped by diplomacy so far. So, why has there been so little headway towards peace in either of these conflicts? Is diplomacy sort of giving way to deterrence as the main tool for conflict resolution? And what has happened to the UN, which has been the primary forum for diplomatic efforts to resolve conflicts? And how do we understand the return of Donald Trump to the international stage? Will he be an enabler of peace, as some seem to expect and hope, or does he spell more conflict? And can India play a more active role in conflict mitigation? To help us understand all these questions a little better, we have with us someone who has worked for a long time in the field of conflict mitigation. Comfort Ero, President and CEO of the International Crisis Group, who is in Delhi for the Raisina dialogues. She's agreed to come to the Hindu office. Thank you so much, Comfort, and welcome to the pod.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure as well.
Thank you. So, Comfort, I want to start by asking you about the United Nations. It's the biggest forum. When you have so many countries, there will be conflict, and the UN has been an agent in the past for peace, for promoting dialogue. But in recent times, it seems to be sort of getting marginalized. UN personnel have been killed with impunity in certain conflicts. So there seems to be a decreasing amount of respect that it seems to command. So how do you view this trend, this phenomenon? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thank you very much, and again, thank you for inviting me as well. And it's a real pleasure to be doing this podcast with you. When you were giving your introduction and you were asking the question, the UN and particularly the Security Council is the primary chamber for peace and security. It's its sole mandate. And a number of observers are looking with a lot of concern that the Security Council is no longer able to successfully navigate its mandate. When you look at the history since its founding at the end of the Cold War, there have been, many twists and turns. There have been periods of crisis and turbulence. So, in a sense, there's nothing new here. But I think when we sit back, this is the worst time um, for the Security Council, and it's a sense it adds to that concern of a crisis in multilateralism. Now, I give you a very good example because you made reference to the resolutions that the Security Council sort of drafts and issues. Last year there were 305 meetings of the Security Council, that the largest since the end of the Cold War.
So the largest number of
Yeah,
resolutions.
the largest number of meetings.
So the
And
largest number of
40
meetings seems to
meetings.
coincide with what
Yeah.
you also say is the worst period in terms of its
But
ability to.
not only was 2024 the year where the Security Council met on a rapid occasions, but only 46 resolutions were passed. And even all of those, although they're signed in pen, they are still very fragile as well. And it's indicative of just how dysfunctional the Security Council is, because it's not a chamber where you're going to resolve the question of Ukraine. And even the crisis of our time that you mentioned, Gaza, we've seen how the Security Council has not been able to manage that, principally also because one of Israel's staunchest allies, number one ally is the United States, but also you've got other key actors there, have struggled to pass resolution, has struggled to provide significant sort of through line and resolution to this crisis as well. And there's a sense also in which the Security Council, in those crises that it's traditionally known for, has marginalized, or there's a danger that the Security Council increasingly is marginalizing itself from places where it should be the natural lead actor. So whether it's in places like the Sahel, or where it was forced, you recall in Mali, the regime there asked it to exit. In the Great Lakes, in the Congo, it has little headway there. In Sudan, it has, again, little political leverage there. In Myanmar, again, little leeway in which to maneuver itself. So you're right that people are now calling it into question, the role of the Security Council. But if we assume that the Security Council is the UN, then of course there is a crisis of legitimacy, there's a loss of confidence, and there's suspicion. But that is not the entirety of the United Nations. There are still important agencies, humanitarian agencies. It is still the frontline actor.
The one which has been expelled by Israel, which is a member of
Yeah,
the UN.
and UNRWA as well. This is the
Yeah, I'm referring to.
life saving body for Palestinians throughout the region as well. So it's still playing that crucial role. But I do worry, and I think by the end of this year, by the time we meet for the High Level Week and General Assembly Week, the debt of the security of the United Nations as a whole will rise to extraordinary figures, and it coincides at the time when we're seeing the entire liquidation of USAID, a prime funder of humanitarian work, and at a time where other international aid agencies as well are rolling back their capacity. So there's a lot to worry about, but the UN is still the place where member states want to sort of air out their problems. They all still come to the General Assembly every September, and on that podium they either bash the UN or call on sort of international community to stand up to meet the moment that we're in. So it's a love-hate relationship. It's an awkward relationship. But they all still want to come to the Security Council. They all still want to come to New York as well, which is reassuring at one level as well.
Right. I mean, I wonder if that has got more to do with the kind of prestige value which the Security Council membership still commands, or in terms of real leverage to make things happen. In this context, I was just wondering, there are two dysfunctionalities with regard to the Security Council which has been talked about. One, of course, is the inability to sort of pass certain kinds of resolutions because of the veto power. The example of Israel is something that you mentioned. The other one is where you do pass a resolution and then nothing happens in terms of that resolution making an impact.
Yeah.
So do you think both of these two, which one do you think is a more serious crisis of
Both are real. Both play out. You've just mentioned is Israel. That it's almost predictable what the outcome is going to be in every situation where Israel has as a subject, as an issue of concern has come to the Security Council. You almost know what the position of the United States is going to be as well. And then you talked about a real problem, which is why Crisis Group judges this era, this moment, as a crisis of peacemaking, is that you pass a resolution, you mandate the Security Council, you mandate the UN to take up a particular task, and oftentimes the weak link, what makes it fragile, what makes it unstable and fragile, is the fact that there's no political leverage. That the entire political leverage of the Security Council is not brought to bear to ensure the sustainability, the full implementation of that resolution, and to make sure you can corral all the key actors together. So much so that you can find regimes, juntas, that are able to overnight ask the UN to exit, i.e., you mentioned Mali, and also in Sudan, and where there's a cast of characters who are able to call into question the legitimacy of the Security Council. So the will, the leverage, the entire being that the Security Council can provide is more fragile today. And I think what makes it also fragile is that it's increasingly clear, despite the amount of meetings I said to you the council had last year, and despite the fact that people still want to come to the UN and exercise their power at the podium of the General Assembly. Increasingly, the UN is not the only game in town. So you'll see that regions themselves are rising in strength and power, which the UN also encouraged. We shouldn't forget, Chapter 8 of the United Nations Charter that says the regions first, and if the regions can't do it, then we take it to the UN. But increasingly, the region is sort of becoming the main power. I know you've seen sort of
Which regional body would you consider
I would, the African Union. In fact, the African Union in itself is seen as the other preeminent multilateral entity. And even there, I think there's a lot that can be said about the failures or the missteps or the miscalculations of the African Union. You've got the regional body ECOWAS for West Africa. These are really the core. You don't really see this with ASEAN. And, the European Union has always seen itself as closely aligned to the United Nations as well. But increasingly in this kind of like dysfunctional, big power rivalry, major power contest, the chambers of the Security Council less and less can play a political role, even if the Secretary General tries to play that sort of humanitarian, human rights voice. A number of these major political questions are mediated elsewhere. And that says a lot about the value of the Security Council as well.
Right. I mean, the UN, at the end of the day, is also one platform for diplomacy where the weaker countries have some kind of leverage over the stronger ones or the mighty powers.
Yeah.
But I was quite interested to sort of listen to one of your statements recently. You said that diplomacy more and more is giving way to deterrence.
Yeah.
As the prime source of peace and stability. Now, I was just wondering if you can sort of elaborate on this distinction you're making, because was diplomacy ever effective without credible deterrence to back it, or is it more the case now, especially with the UN sort of breaking down? Now, either you have deterrence or you're bust, which is what I think the Palestinians are discovering, which is what Zelensky discovered really well in I think the Oval Office. So, is that what you think is happening, or was it always the case? We just didn't really pay attention.
Let me say something about weak states as well. Weak states, small states, middle power countries, they still, and even major powers, they still see value in the United Nations as well. And you'll know that at the General Assembly last year, we had the Summit of the Future, the Pact of the Future as well. And that old debate about, reform of the UN and reform of the Security Council is a live debate as well. And that, the question is, what size of the Security Council, what would happen with the veto power, which countries from which regions would be represented. It will be a contest between Brazil and Argentina. For Africa, it's not just about Nigeria and South Africa, it's also about the other regions of Africa. And then in Asia, who will be the sort of the additional Asian country that would get a seat at the Security Council. So I just want to underline that fact that despite everything that's said about the Security Council and whether it functions, there's still a desire to be in that chamber as well, because that prestige that you mentioned. Now, on deterrence and diplomacy, I think the two are intertwined as well, and they play out at different stages as well. Let's look at, for example, within Europe, the need to step up and rethink Europe's security architecture is largely about deterrence, about making sure that you never see this kind of usurping of the principle of non-aggression again. So this is not just about Ukraine, but this is about the future of European security architecture. And the centerpiece of that new security architecture, which cannot do away with Russia. Russia's part of that, but it's one that ensures that Russia doesn't repeat this again. So it's about deterring Russia from doing a repeat of what it did in 2014 with Crimea first, and then the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. So that's part of the debate. But for that deterrence also to be sustainable, it does require diplomacy, and it's a delicate dance. So, at one level, it's also about the nuclear deterrence, but that's not enough. I think it's also making sure that Russia doesn't repeat what it did, and the regions around Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, the Baltic countries, they're pretty clear. And one of the reasons why you saw two European countries, both Finland and Sweden, join NATO, was because they saw that their security was better served by entering NATO to deter Russia. And that Article 5 becomes very precious. It's also why Zelensky is raising it. He believes that once Ukraine is part of NATO, it's a way in which it's an important guardrail, and that's why you see Article 5 being brought up again. It's also why, despite the invasion in Ukraine, and despite the tragedy that we're seeing and the heightened nature of insecurity now in Europe, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that throughout this crisis, the one thing that hasn't happened, if we haven't seen an escalation into one of the NATO countries. Why? Because 3 of those allies are nuclear powers. So Russia has seen both the limits of its own, the fact that it's also a nuclear power, but ironically, Europe has also seen that the threat of a nuclear power a threat from Russia has also been what has neutered its ability to escalate as well. So it's played out in an interesting way. That has been an important deterrence. Now, what is the takeaway from any other country that doesn't have nuclear power? They see that actually to have nuclear power gives you leverage, gives you a seat at the table, and allows you to dictate the pace of things as well. It doesn't necessarily safeguard you, but it's an important piece of the jigsaw. And this is why I talked about how deterrence itself has become is an important tool, even more today. But that doesn't mean that you can escape the importance of diplomacy. And what we're watching right now within Europe, it's not just about deterrence, but it's also about what are the key mechanisms, diplomatic tools that are going to be instrumental to encouraging Russia to come to the table.
I was just wondering, would you? There is a view that the reason Europe finds itself in the situation it does today, where you're talking about deterrence as a centerpiece of its security architecture, is possibly because of a failure of diplomacy, maybe 10, 15 years ago. The strategists like John Mearsheimer, Jeffrey Sachs, they've been saying that the Ukraine war could have been avoided had the United States kept its diplomatic promise to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand a post-Cold War, or at least not expand right up to Russia's borders. This was a promise made, and it was a promise broken. So, would that be a case to say that there is a strategic blunder here that the Europeans made, given that the reason for the war, which is Ukraine wanting to join NATO, is now not on the table at all? So, you've gone through aiding Ukraine in its military face-off with Russia for 3 years, and now you're back to square one. You're not going to be able to join NATO, and you're not going to most probably not get back 20% of the territory which the Russians have taken. And that has been the preconditions for the Russians to come and talk to the Ukrainians themselves. And Trump is on board with either of these. He says, he's told Zelensky, forget about it, it's very unlikely that you're going to be joining NATO. And Europeans might not like it, but I don't see how they're going to change that. So do you think there was a miscalculation here, and do you think John Mearsheimer has been proved right?
Look, history has been written as we speak. By the way, this whole issue about NATO, it's not new to the Trump administration. He articulated what was already known in private. In public, a number of European countries, said get back the areas that was lost by Ukraine, and that NATO, Ukraine has to be part of NATO. that was public posturing. But a number of them privately conceded that Ukraine wouldn't be part of NATO, and that it was unlikely that it would be able to claw back the territories that it had lost in 2022, or the idea that it can go back to the early years as well. What people are contesting, European leaders were contesting, was that you would give this up publicly from the US side. So what was privately understood was never publicly articulated. So you took away the one leverage that was key to your negotiations with Russia. So I think that's important to acknowledge. The other issue to acknowledge is that, when you'll remember, because you made reference to Gorbachev and what was promised and what wasn't promised. Back then, Ukraine conceded that it would not have nuclear capability. So Ukraine has already made a number of concessions as well. Let's not forget that Putin himself has an image of Russia that he wants to, or an era of Russia that he wants to go back to. He felt that the end of the Cold War and post 1991 was the nadir of Russian sort of politics and great power. In a sense, Putin wants what Trump is now doing. He talks about making America great again. You can see Russia too. Putin too wants to make Russia great again. So this is not. I hear what you're saying about your references to these two great scholars, but this is also about the image Putin has for Russia, his view of Russia's place as one of the architects of international peace and security. In a sense, Putin wants to go back and have his Yalta II moment again, where it was the great powers of the end of the Second World War, Stalin.
Yes,
and
I see what you are saying about.
he wants that Yalta II moment again.
Yes, yes.
But the world has moved on from that.
Yes. I see what you're saying, but this point has not been made only by John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs. Henry Kissinger, I think, wrote the piece. You must be familiar, where he said that the U.S. foreign policy always needs an enemy. So if it always needs an enemy, then you need to sort of manufacture one, whether or not the enemy is ready for it. So Russia was the enemy. Now, for whatever strategic shifts of the Trump administration, now there seem to be sort of more interested in collaboration, and the enemy seems to the mantle seems to be shifting towards China. So that is one.
Well, I don't know if that's clear yet.
Okay.
And at one level, I mean, Trump is unpredictable. I would be always careful about how I sort of move ahead of his own thinking. What is uniquely different about America this time? It seems to be sort of given a little bit more room to its foes, or people that we understood were the foes, i.e. Russia and China. And it seems to be going for its allies as well. So this is a starkly different United States as well. And if you look, it's the allies who are more nervous. It's the allies who are having to readjust. It's the allies who are having to sort of rewrite the script and open a new chapter.
All allies except Israel. Would that be?
Well, I mean, sorry, yes, you're right. Every single sort of administration has been, you're right, has been very staunchly pro-Israel. This particular president too. In terms of transatlantic relationships, I should qualify. In relation to Western Europe, I mean, it's quite a stark messaging, but also into Latin America, and also to Canada as well. It's like one full sweep. I think this has left them anxious. It's left them nervous. It's left Europe very traumatized. It's left Europe in an emotional state, and it's left Canada as well really quite surprised that in no period in its entire relationship with the United States has it ever seen a situation like this, and they take it quite seriously, and they see it as existential and dangerous, and they see this expansionist rhetoric as serious, both vis-a-vis Canada and the Panama Canal and Greenland. And you can see Europe right now wrong-footed, but realizing that they have to take this seriously. But it's also not a surprise, because Trump is only now putting into fifth gear what his predecessors had already articulated. So Obama was the one who said that Europe were free riders. Biden also had indicated that they wanted to pivot to China. Clinton had said the same thing. But now Trump is coming in, in a way, as one of our trustees said recently, with Kamala Harris, she would have closed the door politely towards Europe, whereas Trump is slamming it with our fingers still on the door, and it's very painful and it's very traumatizing, and it's a shock therapy to one of the most important allies for the United States. But India is also an ally. He hasn't treated India in the way that he's treating Europe at the moment.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, we will come to India
yeah.
in a bit. So I wanted to ask you. So you spoke at great length and so well about how Trump's new whatever this coming to the global stage has sort of really put Europe off its game. So, but going beyond Europe, how do you in the early weeks of his presidency, with this Gaza peace plan, which he sort of sent Steve Witkoff and sort of put it into place, and now this Ukraine ceasefire plan. So there was a lot of talk about Trump being an enabler of peace, which has sort of really dipped after Israel started bombing last couple of days. But still, do you see Trump's the global churn which he has unleashed with his unpredictability? Do you think it's sort of leading towards maybe some kind of quietism, if not peace, or is it going to spell more conflict in the days to come? Which way do you think he's sort of blowing in general?
Yeah, look, it's a good question to ask. I mean, look, the question I think we should ask is whether Trump too is either going to accelerate some of the trend lines that we've been watching in the last 2 years, and some of them instigated by the previous Democratic administration, or whether we're going to see sort of new set of facts as well. From a conflict prevention organization like Crisis Group, I don't want to catastrophize and suggest that there's no opportunities here. Trump always said that he was going to make a deal of some sort, and he's a deal maker, and he wants to see a grand bargain, and he's very much thinking about his legacy, the Nobel Peace Prize, and all those things. Whether that's still on the table, it's neither here nor there. But I think there was an opportunity. He's opened the doors for opportunities and in innovation. The question is which path it's going to go. And you're right to put a spotlight on the fact that, and it's a choice, that the ceasefire appears to be broken. I would not suggest that it was inevitable. Even if both sides came into the process with a lot of doubt and suspicion, and trust has collapsed between Netanyahu and Hamas. Even if it was a troubled process, and as a prime minister, Qatar prime minister rightly indicated, it's the same deal that they were trying to put on the table 13 months ago. The pressure of Trump and him making it very clear to both sides that he wanted to have the ceasefire was clearly down to him. So he instigated that, even though it was crafted.
In a way, that also exposed the Biden administration, which never did.
He exposed the Biden administration, but I think this was also a unique moment in that it was the Biden administration and the Trump transition team at the time that came together to get this deal. But it's clearly a Trump deal because his main negotiator, Steve Witkoff, was very instrumental in that, alongside with the Biden team, especially his close team working on the region as well. But it's clearly a Trump peace process. It's clearly a Trump ceasefire. So that's it. So, and I think we should acknowledge that. But it's a choice because, for Netanyahu, that objective of wanting to eradicate Hamas is still a prime objective of his. And there's a sense in which the Gaza proposal may have green-lighted other agendas, particularly on the West Bank, given green light for that expansionist tendencies to grab the rest of the West Bank. But what was already happening on the eve of Trump coming to power, there was already a sense of lawlessness that we'd seen in the last 4 years as a result of what was going on in Gaza. There was already a multilateralism in crisis. There was already a question mark about international cooperation. We were seeing wars rising. We were also seeing, as I was suggesting, a sense of a lack of legitimacy and trust breaking down. These weren't instigated by Trump. In a sense, at one level, he's a symptom of the international crisis. The question is, what's new by Trump? And this sense of going after allies first is certainly what one could argue is slightly newer from the Trump administration, as opposed to the other factors that I
While
outlined.
what you're saying, I completely agree with you that this
Yeah.
going after allies is a new thing. Do you think, in a sense, the allies sort of probably invited this upon themselves by refusing to sort of speak and take a stand with, with some kind of autonomy from what the US's line was? And the great example of this would be Gaza itself. You come from a background of conflict prevention, mitigation, resolution. So this continued backing of the entire Western European political leaderships for the relentless slaughter which has been going on in Gaza, which goes against their own values of a rules-based international order,
Yeah.
all the rules being broken by Israel, and any criticism of Israel being framed as this fake crisis of anti-Semitism within Europe. Germany is a good example. So how do you see?
I
How do
wouldn't
you
say
see?
it's,
Do you
yeah.
think this reluctance to take a stand on this probably sort of undermine their own legitimacy, at least in the eyes of the global South, to a
Yeah.
large extent? Do you think that was part of the problem? And also, secondly, on this question, how do you see a pathway to peace that might actually work with the Israeli leadership that we have today?
Look, I wouldn't just blame Europe on and I wouldn't call it fake anti-Semitism as well. However, I also would break down Europe because there are tensions. That there is no clear consensus on the question of of Gaza from Europe, and I think that's partly the problem. So you see countries like Luxembourg, Belgium, the Irish, Spain, Norway, not only giving credence to the idea of Palestinian statehood, but also being very more vocal about their dissatisfaction. And I mean, and the cost has been quite significant for a country like Norway. You saw the diplomatic spat between Ireland, for example, and Israel. So there's been a cost to them, and there is that delicate, very difficult history with Germany that made it very difficult for Germany, both domestically, also to navigate its own path. But you're right to say that this has also exposed Europe in terms of its values and principles, and how it's managed to navigate Ukraine, and then and then to be very weak in terms of those rules vis-a-vis Gaza. So I agree with you, and it's not just Gaza, but it's in other areas. But I would say that it's not on the question of Gaza and Israel Palestine that has brought a wrench in the relationship between the US and Europe. No, it's on the question of Ukraine. But more fundamentally, it's Trump's belief that this relationship needs to be realigned, and that the burden sharing has to be rethought, and that it looks unfair, it looks uneven, and that the US is pretty clear that it wants to pivot to China, and that Europe has to step up. That is at the core center of the tensions between Washington and Europe at this time. And that is why you're seeing, you saw the conversation in the lead up to Munich. You heard the conversation that J.D. Vance articulated at Munich. And it's left me asking myself two questions. Is it that, what is it that Washington wants in terms of the future relationship with Europe, and how does it see Europe? Does it want to see a stronger Europe that is able to take care of its own backyard, that is able to provide a realigned security architecture, that is able to deter Russia and leave Europe stronger? Or is it a weaker Europe where Russia definitely sees Europe as its sphere of influence, and where Washington, at least Trump's Washington, wants to see more far right leaning governments
Trump's
come?
answer to this is, I mean, Russia is primarily, I mean, if you think it's a problem, it's your problem, but we've got this big ocean between Europe
Well, it's a
and the
bigger,
US.
yeah, but that's the difference between, and again, I think this is maybe what is slightly newer about this administration, that it's articulating a more sharper view of the Europe it wants to see. And there are two strands, two competing strands in the administration right now. One that would appear more traditional, that wants to see a stronger Europe, and one that may want to see a weaker Europe, or one where Russia, one where it sees that Russia's sphere of influence is also Europe, which leaves parts of Europe, not all parts because it's not unified, but parts of Europe very, very concerned about that agenda. That if we're moving into a sphere of influence mode, what does that mean for Europe's own relationship with Russia? How does Russia view its own alliances, and would that embolden and give a green light to Russia to not just stop at Ukraine, but then to start moving into other areas? And that becomes precarious for the Moldovas, for the Georgias, for the Baltic countries. And that then raises the question about what the deterrence architecture, going back to our earlier conversation, what the deterrent architecture looks like for Europe, which is why you're seeing this flurry of activity of and Europe now being forced to think more seriously, more quicker about the future of its own defense security expenditure, not just with Europe, but bringing in others who are not part of the European Union, so the UK, Norway, and interestingly, a debate with Turkey as well, and Japan also becomes an interesting part of that conversation as well.
Yes, I mean, Europe certainly has a lot of thinking and
Yeah.
processing to do. Just have two more questions for you before we wrap up.
Mm.
Let's move away from Europe for a bit and come to the question of China. You know, that's a big
Yeah.
quote unquote elephant in this entire geopolitical landscape that we haven't really
Exactly.
discussed.
That's the third pillar.
Yeah. So do you agree with the general assessment, which seems to be the dominant consensus in Western strategy circles, that China is a wannabe global hegemon, or do you think this assessment is rooted in a perceived threat to the US's current status as the hegemon? You know, I mean, if you want to frame it differently, if a Trump-led US were to reconcile with a multipolar geopolitical landscape, rather than continue to stick on with their traditional exceptionalist kind of a stance, would that lead to a different conception of China and the so-called Chinese threat, or is this assessment of China as a global hegemon going to be the dominant consensus?
Yeah, that's a very good loaded question as well. Look, I think it's debatable whether China wants to become a hegemon, at least in the classic sense of what the United States was. I don't think it wants to, I don't think it's ready for that, or necessarily wants to have that responsibility. It certainly wants to be a hegemon in its own region.
Yes.
Certainly, and India will know all about that. But does it want to be that global, more sort of wider
Would you
player?
read that Belt and Road Initiative, which is all over the world, as a part of that, or is that more of a economic,
Look,
limited?
that's more economic. It's also part of the long game that China plays, sort of patient capital. And it fits in, yes, with the fact that China at home needs more resources, and so the external outreach into the hinterlands and negotiating better into the bottom dollar is part of that strategy. But I don't think it neither wants to, it's ready to, and to play that global role. But in its region, but even Asia is vast, so we also have to qualify what we mean about China's own sphere of influence. And I think there we can think through about the South China Sea, Taiwan. It's certainly what is clear, at least for our own analysis from the observations that I've made, is that what makes China nervous, what its primary concern is that the U.S. Is trying to shape alliances in a region where it wants to be the prime shaper of the rules of the game, of the rules of the road,
Like the Quad.
like the Quad, and the BRICS, and this makes China nervous that the U.S. itself is realigning relationships in the region where China wants to see
So is this
itself
like
as
a
a primary.
self-fulfilling prophecy for the US? I mean, China, you're saying in terms of intentionality, you're not able to read that intention, that it wants to be a global hegemon. But the US is sort of nervous about China's growing influence, and even if it's in own spheres of influence, and therefore it is setting up these different kind of entities like the Quad, for instance, which in turn makes China nervous, and it then leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy where you reach some kind of a conflict
Well, look,
situation.
I think we should also now ask ourselves about what Trump's own outlook is here, because it's true Trump was the Quad also came under Trump, but what does Trump want in terms of China? And there are people, there are two schools, maybe three schools of thought within his own administration, within his own team. It's very clear that Trump wants to have a relationship with Xi, and you'll recall during with President Xi, and you'll recall during the elections that he had beautiful words for President Xi. It's the limit of Trump's relationship about trade. Take note that it was only a 10% tariff, as opposed to the stronger, more harsher tariffs that he had for his allies. This goes back to what I was saying about the difference between foes, or people who we think are foes and enemies, and allies. So there is a difference. Okay. Now there are hawks in the administration that want to constrain, contain China's ambition, and they seek limited accommodation for China on the global scale. There are others, and this is where Trump leans in that they are focused on a trade and the tariffs, and negotiating that is part of Trump's worldview, and probably the most important part of his worldview. But I still think there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of where the rest of the administration, and it's that tension, and the question is who wins in that tension. Pay attention to how Trump frames all his perspectives, whether it's on China, whether it's on the rest of Asia, whether it's on the Middle East, whether it's on Europe. There are differences of opinion in his administration, but his view in the end is what matters. And so far he's limited his views on China to trade and tariffs as well. Now, the rest of it is the unknown bit, where he sits on Taiwan and the South China Sea. And, Taiwan is already sort of reading into what is happening in Europe, reading into what that means for itself. So suggesting that it's going to ramp up its own defense to show that it can be also a responsible player. But so far, Trump has oscillated on its own position vis-a-vis Taiwan and vis-a-vis the rest of the region. And let's be also clear that the region also has agency. So the region, whether it's Indonesia, India, Philippines, all the other countries themselves, also playing a hedging game. They don't want to be caught in a tug of war between China. They don't want to be caught in any miscalculation, any misjudgment, or any error.
Like Ukraine was.
Now you want to open a whole new debate. Look, I think we have to be clear, regardless of your reading on Ukraine, that there was an invasion by Russia into Ukraine. I know there are different strands and
we won't go there, but I really buy your point. It's a very good point you made that Trump's pronouncements in terms of clarity, in terms of what is clearly understandable as opposed to his whimsicalities, has been restricted to the economic dimension of China, and he hasn't really said anything
Yeah.
on the
Yeah.
strategic
Yeah.
geopolitical
Exactly.
aspect of the dynamic.
Yeah.
That's, I think, very important
Yeah.
to keep in mind. I won't keep you for much longer. My
No,
last question,
that's
yeah,
good.
which is
Yeah.
to do with India. So, as you know, India has followed this. We used to be non-aligned, now we are multi-aligned,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So, do you think it is feasible and wise for India to continue its current trajectory of increasingly closer strategic partnership with the US, along with continued dependence on Russian defense supplies and so on, and also close partnership? At the same time, a geopolitically tense but economically intertwined dynamic with China. Do you think this is a sustainable path for India? Is it like, can it be the core of our foreign policy, or does it need to evolve a little bit more now that we have got a new sheriff in town, so to speak?
It's sustainable until it's not sustainable. It's not just now that India it's crafted its foreign policy vis-a-vis the United States, and whenever a new president comes in, you try to sort of get a temperature of the room and get a sense of what to expect from it as well. And I think in the end, the one key word for me is that India has been adapting to the new realities coming out of Washington, but also in its own region vis-a-vis Russia as a result of the invasion of Ukraine into Ukraine, but also vis-a-vis China. The multi-aligned is interesting, and I'd like to quote your foreign minister, if I may. I think and also Modi, Prime Minister Modi more recently, but more interestingly is Foreign Minister Jaichenko, because I listened to him at Raisina, but also in his own book, and I think he said it very well in terms of this current moment that we're in, and what the current moment means for how India positions itself. And I think it speaks quite realistically into how India views it. So he said, this is a time for us to engage America, manage China, and cultivate Europe and reassure Russia, bring Japan into play, draw neighbors in, extend the neighborhood, and expand traditional constituencies. That is a dose of realism. It's a reality of the international, of how fluid the international arena is. It's a sort of a realization also of the competing interests and demands, but a recognition of where India sits in terms of the geography and its neighborhood, and an appreciation of its neighborhood. But if you wanted a very good example of the hedging that every country has to play, it's in the articulation of your foreign minister, and it's a perfect one. But it's also a recognition that you don't want to be caught off guard, and that you've got to make sure that you're flexible without losing a sense of your national interest as well. So the neutrality position on Russia, it's tied also to defense. The strategic alliance with America, it's also tied to economics, and the fact that there's a strong India diaspora, by the way, that strongly supports Trump. The managing China also of the highest level of insecurity on the Himalayas. It's a cost to both countries, 50,000 troops. This is a costly proposition for both countries.
Yeah,
And
our
it's a
Prime Minister's latest statement in that interview.
and your prime
Yeah,
minister's statement in this really great podcast he
yeah,
did, and it's a recognition and an opening of the door to China, and a recognition that we can't carry on in this path. That diplomacy is important. We will also have our own framework of deterrence, but we also open the door to a delicate diplomatic dance with China, and it's a reality. It's a reading, because you also it's not Washington also that's going to determine and shape your foreign policy and your relationship with China. It's you as India you have to make those calculations as well, and for me it's a reading of the environment, and it's a very careful, crafted reading. So the multi-align still makes sense until it no longer works, and the only thing I would say is that until we've understood despite what I've just said, until we've understood what the relationship with China is going to look like with the US, it's going to be hard to determine what the next path will be for all the countries in Asia that are all hedging and trying to figure themselves out. But I think the multi-aligned makes sense right now economically, in terms of security. And it's interesting for us that India is not only part of the Quad, it's part of the BRICS, and it makes a point of being part of all these various alliances, because the more that you're able to sort of spread your relationships, the easier you're also able to protect your own national interests as well.
Right, I mean, that's really well articulated both by you and also by our foreign minister. I mean, I completely agree with this dose of realism undergirding this delicate balance of diplomacy and a framework of deterrence. But as you also rightly pointed out, there is this big black box. We don't know what's going to be coming out of it, what's inside, which is the US's relationship with Trump eventually under Trump, how it's going to evolve. I think that it could completely flip all our assumptions of multi-alignment, and it may not flip also.
It may not, and I think the other thing that's at the heart of it, which shaped Prime Minister Modi's own recent visit in February, was around tariffs and defense as well, knowing that is coming down the pipeline. And of course, we've got the 2nd of April further articulation of more tariffs from the United States. Positioning yourselves, either getting ahead of what the announcement is, offering something, showing yourself that you're an ally also, but also showing that you have agency as well. It's not that India is a small time player. We actually see India as a upper middle power. Has very clear ambitions, has set its stall, has a very clear economic and foreign policy. So it has agency in this. And I wouldn't necessarily wait to see what the US is going to announce with China, but position yourself and read the landscape, but also shape the landscape in a way that suits your own foreign policy as well.
Yes, I mean, India is a significant power, and it has agency, and it is not afraid to use it. That's all I have for you.
Thank you so much. It's been great. And it's also good to end on home turf as well. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much. A real pleasure.